keep smiling faces here. Today's speaker is Autumn Fesperman. And Autumn is here to talk about her book, The Perfect Storm. And if you remember, a few weeks ago we had a costumed interpreter talking about this particular story of the shipwreck of the Sea Venture. But today we have someone who wrote a book about it. And Autumn has spent, the story was in Bermuda, and Autumn has spent a great deal of time in Bermuda and is going back this week, right?
Back on the 23rd
So,
for another visit.
I'm going to read to you a lecture overview. The stories of history aren't all in the history books. Based on actual first-hand accounts and research from a shipwreck, there is much more to the story of Jamestown nearly faltering. The wreck of the Sea Venture diverted many well-known colonists. John Rolfe and his first wife, Sir Thomas Gates, Pastor Buck, Thomas Dale, Admiral Sir George Somers, Captain Christopher Newport, and many others. This delay came with supplies in part of the darkest time of the Jamestown colony. This children's book brings the story to life. And a little bit about Autumn. Well, Autumn teaches in Goochland County, for the Goochland County Public Schools. She's an author, illustrator, and a middle school art teacher. She lives in Chester and has spent a lot of time in Tidewater and Bermuda, where the story takes place. And I will say, and she probably will tell you this too, she did all of the illustrations, and they're quite impressive. So every illustration from this book, she did with her own hand, and to me, that's very impressive. So,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now my screen disappeared again. So. Well, I can start talking here while we get the screen back up. It's on the screensaver. See if it comes up. It seems to have a mind of its own today.
Hey, let's take a quick break. Let me see if I can't get this straight. Give me about 10, 15 minutes. Hopefully not that long.
Well, I can start talking. It's fine if you want to just hang out here next to me. Alright, so she mentioned that I spent a lot of time in Bermuda. I was a Navy brat. My dad was stationed there, and I lived there for about 4 years. So as a teenager in Bermuda, I went to every beach, I went snorkeling, I went boating, I did all of these fun things. And while I lived there, I didn't learn about the Jamestown story. So you think about if you live in another area, you don't learn about Jamestown in history class in elementary or middle school. So when I came back to history class in high school, Jamestown was a whole new story for me.
There it is.
There it is.
Let's run with it for a minute.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Okay. All right, so there's a lot of reasons why my book is called The Perfect Storm. It was a perfect storm of events that culminated for the events to happen, and it was a perfect storm of events to culminate for me to be the person to write and illustrate this book. So I went back as an adult, as an art teacher, and was a substitute for a semester for a Bermuda school as their art teacher. And I noticed that the history of Jamestown is sort of mentioned, but it's not really indulged upon. They teach the history of Bermuda. And Bermudian history says that Bermuda was discovered by a shipwreck by a crew that very haphazardly crashed into the island. They didn't have skill, they didn't have a good boat, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't know about the reefs. It's a very negative impression of how this island was started. So with research recently, they have uncovered shipwrights' notes in England, the original ship design. They have uncovered from first-hand accounts the true story of what really happened. And 2 different writers wrote a first-hand account that were on the ship, and those did survive and were eventually sent back to England. They weren't published right away. The Virginia company didn't want everyone to know that they were having shipwrecks. So they kind of delayed that for about 20 years before that was actually published and people of London heard about it. And then it wasn't really mentioned again. It was found in a Princeton library, one of the 3 copies of that, the letter back to Virginia Company. He made 3. And one of those was discovered and donated to the Princeton library, and someone published it. And they tried to do the best that they could to kind of interpret it, because it was in Old English. So when you try to read the calligraphy of Old English and then the way that they talked in Old English, it's difficult to read that, to understand that. So they transcribed it, and that was published in the 60s, and no one's really paid attention to it since. There are a few books out now based on that story, but the Bermuda history hasn't really changed. Where'd we go? Okay. So in Bermuda, they teach you that it was such an ill-fated voyage. But in reality, from all of their research and all of their new maritime archaeology research, they figured out that this boat, they tested it with computer models. And it was super sturdy, super well designed. It was super skilled navigation that got them through the reefs. And they actually entered the reefs and landed on Bermuda in one of the very smallest, only places you can get that close to shore and not crash into a reef. So it was super expert seamanship of Sir George Somers. He had retired from his seamanship in the English Navy and stuff, and so he was very, very skilled, and they had pulled him back out of retirement to come admiral this fleet. So this fleet of 7 ships included the Sea Venture. They were supposed to be a 3rd supply mission for Jamestown. So the first 2 supply missions came to John Smith, and Christopher Newport had made some of the runs, and so he was also a captain of this ship. But this brand new, top of the line, beautiful ship was the head of the flotilla and had all of the admin on it. It had the admiral, it had the sea captain, it had the new governor, it had the reverend that was appointed to Jamestown. It had all of the admin was on this one boat. So the rest of the boats were full of laborers and general, just people wanting to go to the New World, and not a lot of leadership. So when this boat was separated in a hurricane from the rest of the boats arrived safely. The other 6 arrived safely. So all of these people came to Jamestown, but then there was no leadership. And John Smith had been sent to explore the fall line and sent to get more corn and work with the Powhatan. So there was no leadership at Jamestown either. So things really fell apart after that. But these castaways were able to get off of the ship. It was wedged into a reef very skillfully so that it stayed upright for 2 years. And they actually, for the first few months, just took everything off the boat. They took the rigging, they took the mast, they took the sails, they took supplies, they took anything they could get off of this boat onto land to help them survive. So they decided to build new boats. I wanted to show you too, because a lot of people think that Bermuda is part of the Bahamas, but it's actually way out off of, I think this map is a little off, it's way out off of Cape Hatteras, all by itself. It's not down near the Bahamas, it's actually the 3rd part of the triangle. It's not part of the Bahamas or Florida. It's out in the middle of the Atlantic all by itself. And sailors up until now just called it the Isle of the Devils. There's tons of shipwrecks. They heard cowbirds that would screech at night. It was scary. They thought it was haunted. They thought it had evil spirits. So it was avoided. No one settled it. So when they happened upon this island, they didn't have a choice. It was definitely preferred to being at the bottom of the ocean. To just be on land. They were happy just to be on land. So I'll tell you the story with the book images towards the end of this, but let's see. So while I was teaching, I wasn't even using my slides. So these are the important people that were on this ship. John Roth, Stephen Hopkins. He actually made a trip to the New World before he came on the Mayflower. Not many people know that. He was on this ship as well. Christopher Newport, they were all on this ship. So that's why we care about this ship. So this was the lead ship, and then they were supposed to have a job, supply the new colony. They weren't able to sustain themselves yet. And then also to bring Christianity to the New World. So they had to keep that mission in mind. Otherwise, it was very tempting to just stay in Bermuda. Things were very plentiful. It was a slightly milder climate. It was an easier way of life. There were no Powhatan to work things out with. So several wanted to just stay. here I'm back at where the general story told to the kids. So while I was there, I received an invitation to the Bermuda Underwater Institute. All teachers did, I'm not special, but all the teachers received this invitation to come and see a documentary that had been made. And this company called Look Bermuda had made a documentary about the sea venture, about the shipwreck, about the research, and actually put forth everything to the public so they could see how the story was such a positive story and not a negative one. So they wanted to kind of get this out to schools and turn around the impression and viewpoint that everyone has of this colonization of Bermuda. So they invited us to this presentation. I think I've said most of this already. Let's see. Yeah. But these are paintings that are not mine. These are from Derek Foster, who's a famous Bermudian. Even the ship's dog made it to land safely. So the Bermuda Underwater Exploration Institute put forth this movie called Downing's Wreck, and this is online if you want to see it. It's really engaging and enlightening. It's fascinating to me. I didn't consider myself a historian or really a history buff, but I guess I kind of am now. I love a good story. So it was a fabulous story. So if you want to see how they figured all this out about the shipwreck, it is online, lookbermuda.com under education and films. So one of the people that helped figure all this out and renew interest in this shipwreck that found him was a Navy diver, and the Navy diver stationed in Bermuda figured out that he was a descendant of Yardley, who was one of the people on the ship who was famous in Jamestown. He was in charge of munitions and things like that. So that's why he, reinvigorated. He found the ship, he found the timbers, and he found the shipwreck. Ironically, on a place labeled on maps as Sea Venture Flats. I mean, locals had called it Sea Venture Flats in this little particular area for 300 years. And they had looked all over that whole side of the island, but he decided to try and mimic the route the boat would have taken through the reefs, which take forever to grow. So some of these reefs have been there hundreds of years. So he mimicked the route it would have taken from that into that eastern side, and then kept in mind where Sea Venture Flats was, and it had settled. There was big reefs where it had kind of wedged in between, and then over the time of years it had kind of fallen apart, disintegrated, and fell back into a hollow of sand. And so it was covered up by sand, but he noticed the ballast, and he noticed some timbers. So they find shipwrecks by finding all these river stones as the ballast. They didn't have keels back then. So they would have you find a whole collection of these river rocks that are from somewhere in England or Spain that don't belong. They're not coral, they're not anything natural from Bermuda. So they find the ballast, and then they can find other treasures. There are several other shipwrecks at the same time period that help them identify things too. So on the left is the exhibit at the Queen's Gallery at the Maritime Museum, the National Gallery in Bermuda. And it's a beautiful exhibit. It has a bunch of different shipwrecks. This little cabinet on the left is all there is of this ship. A lot of shipwrecks have a lot more things, a lot more personal facts, a lot more tools, but this ship had been cleared. They had scraped this thing clear of anything they could get off of it over the 10 months that they were there. There was nothing left. The few items that were left probably were things that had fallen down in between the floorboards, or somebody dropped while they were working. A hilt of a scabbard that's really fancy, a friendship ring, a syringe. It's like things that someone would have dropped, possibly. So, or that got blown around and waved around. They had 10 feet of water in this hull for 4 days. So there's no telling how these things got washed around in that ship before it actually landed. So on the right are the artifacts from this exhibit that I've kind of pulled out their photos. Those are in the book. So if you're reading the storybook, the children's book, I have painted in and used these items as things in the book that are like the little top left little container, ointment pot is what it's called. I have a mouse sleeping in the top of it. The ring, it's a friendship ring with 2 hands, clasped like this, is a crown on one of the little mice when she's performing a little play. So all of these items are, and they're using the ladle to help bail out like all the water. So if you haven't figured it out, I've substituted mice characters for Christopher Newport and George Summers, his nephew Matthew. I have turned these into little mice characters for my book. The idea of painting portraits and making a historical type story didn't appeal to me. It's like, I don't want to read another history book. I want something fun and engaging that you don't even realize you're learning about history while you read it. Ah, don't go away. Uh-oh. I'm back. I don't know why it's doing this to me today. Identify. Guess I talk too much in between the screen.
Gotta be out in front.
There it is. It's not going to touch. Okay. I don't know what I did or didn't do. So these artifacts you can look for. I'm going to show you images of the paintings. Rather than the book pages, I've actually taken pictures of the paintings without the text on them, and that way you can see the full painting. And then I was going to read the text to you. So as I go through the story, you'll see these objects painted into the story. So I challenge students to try to find these as I read the story. See if they can recognize them. All right, so here's the book. Okay, it's based on the Downing's Wreck documentary, and it's based very strongly on the Stray Kids first-hand account. I have read through that thing backwards and forwards so many times just to make sure I had things in the right order and the right people. And one thing I will say is that as a children's book, I have left out a lot of the more gory details. The story from this shipwreck includes a murder, it includes some political things, some religious things with uprising. Someone claimed to be a Brownist, and that was a big deal. And then they had mutiny, they had a baby die, a second baby die. They had so many things happen that you just can't present nicely in a children's book, and those are not children's topics. But I am trying to work on, and I've done a first draft, more of a novel version of this story, and then I can include some of those things and tell the more harrowing details. Can't really include the harrowing details in a children's book. Not be a nice children's bedtime story. So, but the Bermuda Underwater Institute showed us that documentary, and they were asking us, what can we do to get this story out? So what they produced and put out there was great for high school students. They even divided it into chapters that you could do different segments and different learning units on, but it wasn't really understandable for a younger audience. So they needed something for a younger audience. So at the time, I wasn't a history teacher, I was an art teacher. I didn't really know how I would really be of assistance with that. And then my term there ended, I came back stateside. But then I was thinking about it, I'm like, a children's book, that's my thing. Well, why did I not think of that before? So I took some time and researched it. I went back that next summer, spent tons of time at the Bermuda Maritime Museum and studied the objects, met with people that can show me like the original maps and grant me permission to use the maps and things like that. So I met with a bunch of different experts and wrote the story. It took a year to paint all of these paintings. It's about 26 or so pages of the story, and that's about that many paintings. So it took me a year of weekends and evenings because I was still teaching full time. So it took a year of my extra time in order to complete it. All right, so here's our first page of the story. On a beautiful June day in London, On a beautiful June day in London, the Sea Venture was ready for departure to the British colony of Jamestown. King James I hoped for riches, land, and opportunity. The newly designed English galleon, the Sea Venture, was on her maiden voyage. She was the flagship of a flotilla of 7 ships and 2 small boats. "Welcome aboard," hailed Captain Christopher Newport and Sir George Somers, Admiral of the fleet. Other important adventurers included John Rolfe and his wife, Mistress Horton, Reverend Richard Buck and his family, and writers William Strachey and Sylvester Jourdain. For the rest of the story, I'll call them Sir George and Sir Thomas. "Are we there yet?" the little ones asked. Captain Christopher and Admiral George had docked in Plymouth, England, to pick up an important member of their crew, Captain Sir Thomas Gates, appointed governor for the new colony in Virginia. Soon they were underway, bringing with them tools, supplies, customs, and hope for a new life in Jamestown. And that's Sylvester Jourdain there, constantly writing the story. He was the first-hand account that remained. And then there's our pottery. There's another pottery back there. And there's our ad that Virginia Company put out, the corner of it. See. Everyone settled in for the journey. "Just let the sound of the gentle waves and rocking of the ship lull you to sleep," said Mistress Buck softly. And there's a book there. You might notice this Shakespeare. Shakespeare was very, very popular in England when they left. And Romeo and Juliet had come out, and Midsummer Night's Dream was the most popular play at the time. Just some additional info there. And also too, I left space for text in the publication, so you may see some odd bare spaces, and that's because that's where the text was going to go in the book. Leaving on a mission was reason to celebrate. They entertained themselves and dreamed of their new life. For 2 months, the ships sailed together, never losing sight of each other as they neared Cape Henry off the coast of Virginia. And that candlestick holder was found in the wreck as well. The ring is on her head. She's acting out the Midsummer Night's Dream. With barely a week left, a big storm awakened them. By morning, the ship was so overcome by wind and rain, it could no longer use her sails. Admiral George remained on the Sea Venture's deck, attempting to steer her safely through the huge waves. "This is not rocking me to sleep anymore," said Matthew, Admiral George's nephew. Just when they thought the storm should have passed, it only grew worse. Morning remained as dark as night. They had encountered a hurricane. Swells of the ocean grew, and the rain and wind came down in droves. Oakum from between the joints of the new ship had not quite set and began to come out, creating numerous leaks. 5 feet of water filled the hull, then 10 feet. Governor Thomas enlisted the help of every member on board, bailing out or working the pump to stay afloat. That Bellarmine pottery right there is the key piece that identifies the shipwreck as the Sea Venture. It matches with Jamestown, and it matches with Plymouth, England. So. On the fourth day of the storm, clouds began to part, and Admiral George navigated the ship's position. Not another ship of the flotilla was in sight. Did they survive the storm? Hungry and exhausted, fear set in. They had survived a hurricane, but they were still sinking. "We cannot hold over 10 feet of water in our hull. We must lighten the ship," shouted Governor Thomas. "Toss over your luggage. Toss over liquids, oil, cider, and vinegar. Toss over the cannons," he continued. On the fifth day, Admiral George spent every minute navigating, steering, and searching the horizon. "Land!" he cried. It was the Isles de Bermudas, now called Bermuda. Superstitious sailors had dubbed it the Isle of Devils, but it was not as feared as the bottom of the ocean. With expert knowledge of the island's reefs, Admiral George purposely guided and wedged the Sea Venture between rocks, preventing her from sinking. All 150 passengers, including the ship's dog, arrived safely on the beach. The Sea Venture remained above the waves where supplies and tools could be removed for use. The island was not as scary as imagined. The howling noises were the native cowbird that was easy to catch for food. A few caves even had a little fresh water. "Tell me about the new colony again," Admiral George's nephew asked with a yawn. The castaways found many more resources on the islands that would help them. Large cedar trees, palms, mulberries, limestone, and prickly pears they could eat. Wild boar was also found, possibly left from previous shipwrecks where they swam to shore. Did you know pigs could swim? Pigs could swim. Pigs can swim. I'm still waiting to try prickly pear jam. Every time I go to Bermuda, I try to find somebody with it. And it's like, "Oh, we're out." Birds, fish, lobster, and sea turtles were plentiful and easy to catch. "I caught a sea star." "I caught a fish." "I caught said Matthew. So they were seeing lots of sea creatures that they had no names for, that they had never seen in their lives. Governor Thomas began construction of a new ship. Using masts and beams salvaged from the Sea Venture, Admiral George built a small boat and used it to map the islands. He also hunted and caught enough fish to keep everyone fed. Yes, all 150. He kept everyone fed. "Can I keep him?" asked Matthew. He's got a little pig friend. Governor Thomas made good progress building a new ship. He named her Deliverance. It had been 2 months and no other ships had arrived from Virginia or England to help them. "We need a second ship to fit everyone and supplies," he told Governor Thomas, "and I can build it." Governor Thomas was thankful. He shared his supply of tools, workers, and salvaged ship parts. Much of the timber from the shipwrecked Sea Venture was already used to build the Deliverance, so Admiral George built his ship mostly of local cedar. He named her Patience. So the designer of the Sea Venture was also part of the crew, and so he helped build, it was Frobisher. He's the one that left the documents that helped identify it, all the shipwrights documents in England. So that helped identify the ships as well. And he helped them build 2 new ships. Let's see. I have to hit it twice for that to work. Admiral George planted a garden where Governor Thomas had first set foot on land above the beach. Some seeds brought from England were successful, and some were not. "Aw, onions and potatoes. I wanted watermelons," sulked Matthew. A few items were stored to bring to the colony, but the state of the colony was unknown. With a final look at the bountiful and beautiful islands of Bermuda, Governor Thomas built a monument in Admiral George's garden. He fashioned 2 timbers from the shipwrecked Sea Venture into a cross and mounted it sturdily to a cedar. He attached a 12-pence coin with King James I in the center and inscribed the following: "In memory of our great deliverance, both from a mighty storm and leak, we have set up this to the honor of God. It is the spoil of an English ship called the Sea Venture, bound with 7 ships more to Virginia or Nova Britannia in America. In it were 2 knights, Sir Thomas Gates, Knight, Governor of the English forces in colony there, and Sir George Somers, Knight, Admiral of the seas. Her captain was Christopher Newport. Passengers and mariners she had beside, 150. We were forced to run her ashore under a point that bore southeast from the northern point of the island, which we discovered first, the 8th and 20th of July, 1609. So we could have been called Nova Britannia instead of Virginia. Who knew? Now that doesn't remain, but there is a monument made with the same inscription. And because we still had Strachey's first-hand account with that in it, even though the monument didn't remain, we knew what was on it. So we could replicate it, which is amazing. Many considered staying on the islands. Although they once feared it, plentiful resources and a milder climate quickly appealed to the castaways. These adventurers had a mission, however, to assist the development of Jamestown for the investors of the Virginia Company and King James I. Only a few remained in Bermuda. The rest boarded the 2 new ships, Deliverance and Patience, and set out to complete the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. One of those little mice there was mutinous and when it joined the ship. It took 2 weeks to arrive at the Jamestown colony. It was spring, just after the starving time of winter. All of the ships from the flotilla had arrived except 1 small ship. Looking for family and friends, they found only 60 colonists remained of the original 400. Relations with local natives, Powhatan Indians, were hostile, and morale was low. The entire colony had fallen into illness, idleness, and disrepair. Governor Thomas shared supplies with the starving colonists and reported the sad state of affairs to his passengers. Seeds had not been planted, gardens had not been tended, chickens, pigs, and local deer had all been killed or driven away by the Powhatan. Even fishing further downstream could not gather enough fish. With just 2 weeks of rations left, Governor Thomas assisted the remaining colonists in boarding ships to take them north to Nova Britannia and make their way back to England. "Hey, is that a boat?" asked someone. Halfway down the James River, Lord Thomas Alar's company of 3 ships came into view. "That means food," cheered Matthew. Everyone headed back up the James River to settle Jamestown with fresh workers and additional supplies. Governor Alar had arrived to replace Governor Thomas. Working together, they brought the Jamestown colony back from the brink of disaster. Admiral George volunteered to return to Bermuda to gather wild boar, birds, fish, and supplies to bring back. After all, Bermuda's reefs were dangerous, and he knew them better than anyone. You can decide what's for dinner, Matthew," said his uncle. "You have the choice of fish, or fish." Accompanied by his nephew, Admiral George navigated to Bermuda safely yet again, following his heart's desire to bountiful and beautiful Bermuda. So that's the end of that story of the Sea Venture, and you all know there's so much more to that story afterwards. There are many characters I mentioned in this book that I just barely touched upon. The Buck family, the minister, was actually who married Pocahontas and John Rolfe. So he was the 2nd minister of Jamestown. The first one drowned. There's just so many sad things that happened here too. And I wanted to talk about the characters because this is sort of, after reading everything that I could get my hands on, this is my impression of how the characters would be. So my favorite are the little girl mouse. I named her Lizzie. She's Elizabeth Buck, the daughter of the minister, but it doesn't come across in the book that as a character. Her story isn't this story. But Matthew was actually a little bit older than this. He was a very young sea captain. And if you can imagine why your uncle would take you from your home in England on a ship, you probably weren't a good kid. So he seemed to be a bit of a troublemaker, and either he was orphaned or the family was like, go to sea, grow up, be a man, you know, kind of thing. So I looked up, because I have the benefit of looking up the genealogy and history and seeing what actually followed on for all of these characters. And I know Elizabeth Buck's further story, and I know, well, we don't need this anymore, but, and we know Matthew was later, okay, so here's what happened next. So they go back to Bermuda, and they take their time gathering supplies and things, and Admiral Summers dies from illness from eating pork. So rather than taking the short trip back, as I said, he was also a sea captain. He captained one of the 7 boats before. I don't know. He had captained a boat before. He could drive a ship. But rather than go the 2 weeks back with all the supplies, well, it sounds horrific, but he put his uncle's body in a pickle barrel to preserve it. It's 1600, you know. And they buried his heart in Bermuda because he loved Bermuda so much, and he was a founder of Bermuda. They actually have a grave site, and they buried his heart in Bermuda. And that's why they always say he followed his heart back to Bermuda. It's where he loved. I don't, based on the way he dresses too, with his robe, and he doesn't dress like your normal sea captain with a big huge hat and armor and stuff. He always is portrayed with this laid back, you know, the robes and not all of the armor and stuff. So I just figured that would pass along into his personality. But, so he was buried in England. He was taken back to England. So his nephew Matthew took him back to England in a pickle barrel on the ship for the purpose of claiming his inheritance rather than help the colonists by taking another supply run to Jamestown. So thankfully Jamestown still was, you know, survived without his additional help. But knowing that he did that, it kind of fit right into how my impression of Matthew. So if you noticed, he was always hung up on something or dangling or just getting into trouble. So that to me made it a more relatable story for kids too, was to have that personality in that story for that character. So that's the end of my story. Does anyone have any questions about any of this, or how I came about the story, or the research, or anything?